The forgotten soldier. I didn't think the war would follow me home. After the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, I believed I'd left it all behind. I was wrong. It started with the nightmares. Not the usual flashbacks. No, these were different. Darker. More real. The first time I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing as though I were back in that blasted desert. The heat, the sand, the smell of gunpowder, it all came rushing back. But there was something else too. A figure. In the shadows. Watching me. Its eyes burned like it knew something I didn't. I remember the night I first saw him, during a raid in a village far from base. It was a blur of chaos, bullets flying, buildings crumbling. We were there to secure the area, to make sure the civilians were safe. But it was a massacre. In the heat of it all, I saw him. A soldier crumpled on the ground, half his face gone. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The mission came first. But something about him, his cold, empty eyes, burned into my mind, etching itself deep into my memory. That night, in my dreams, I saw him again. His face was whole this time, but his expression was twisted, angry. He stared at me from across a field of corpses, whispering something I couldn't understand. I tried to look away, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. The ground shifted beneath me, and I fell into the pile of bodies. Their arms reached up, cold and stiff, dragging me down. I woke gasping for breath, but the dream stayed with me. The feeling of his eyes, the stench of death, the weight of a wrong I couldn't quite place. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the PTSD messing with my head again. But then the dreams started bleeding into my waking life. The first time I was sitting in my living room. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching. My mind drifted back to that night, to the raid, to the figure. I glanced out the window and nearly jumped out of my skin. He was there, standing in the street, watching me. I shot up, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. But he was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just a trick of the light, but it kept happening. I'd see him in the corner of my eye, on the street, in the grocery store, even in the reflection of my bathroom mirror. Always the same, silent, distant staring. His gaze bored into me, cold and accusing. I started avoiding mirrors, covering the windows, keeping the lights on all night. But it didn't matter. He was always there, watching, waiting, and then the thing started moving. It was small at first. A picture frame would be tilted, a chair slightly out of place. I thought I was just forgetting where I'd left things. But then one night I woke to the sound of footsteps in my house. I froze in bed, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy to be my own. They creaked across the floorboards, getting closer and closer. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat trickling down my spine. My breath hitched as the footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I didn't dare move. I waited, staring at the door, expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. There was just silence. Deafening, oppressive silence. I forced myself to get up, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, every nerve in my body on edge. The house was dark, still. Too still. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick air. As I reached the living room, I stopped cold. The front door was wide open. My pulse hammered in my ears. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I always did. But now it stood open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Then I saw him. Standing just outside in the street was the soldier. His face was no longer whole. It was just as I had seen it that day in the desert, half gone, a gaping wound where his eye should have been. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the blood dripping down his neck, pooling at his feet. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The room spun, the walls closing in. I blinked and he was gone. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But deep down I knew. He wasn't just a memory. He wasn't just a nightmare. Something had followed me home. It took days for me to get up the nerve to leave the house after that night. The thought of stepping outside, of seeing him again, froze me in place. I started keeping all the blinds shut, the doors bolted. I told myself it was a precaution, a way to keep my mind calm. But it wasn't calm, not really. Every night the same dread crawled over me, seeping into my bones, and I barely slept. When I did sleep, the nightmares returned, even more vivid than before. This time I was back in the village. The raid was over, the gunfire silenced. I walked through the rubble, stepping over bodies, the heat of the day pressing down on me. That's when I saw him, the soldier from before, his face half blown apart, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. But this time he was moving. I stood there frozen as he slowly got to his feet. His body jerked and twitched, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His one remaining eye locked onto mine, and a low guttural sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a word. It was a growl, deep and full of hate. He started limping toward me, dragging one leg behind him, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as he got closer and closer. Then he spoke. His voice was a rasp, barely a whisper, but the words cut through me like a knife. "You left me." I woke with a start, my body drenched in cold sweat. My heart raced as the dream faded, but his voice lingered in my head, echoing over and over again. "You left me." I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream, that somewhere, somehow, he was reaching out from the grave, accusing me, blaming me. That day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, barely glancing around to see if he was out there, watching. My truck was parked in the driveway, and as soon as I got in, I locked the doors like that would keep him out. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove. The empty road stretched out ahead of me, the trees blurring by in a haze. I was running from him, from whatever it was that had attached itself to me. But no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched clung to me. Eventually, I found myself at a diner on the outskirts of town. It was nearly empty, save for a few truckers nursing their coffee. I slid into a booth at the back, away from the windows, and ordered something, anything to keep me busy. I sat there for a while, sipping the bitter coffee, trying to calm my nerves. But I couldn't stop glancing around, expecting to see him, that soldier, lurking in the shadows. My hands shook and I rubbed my temples, trying to shake the image of his mangled face from my mind. "Hey, you all right?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see the waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, staring at me with concern. I hadn't realized how disheveled I must have looked, sweat-soaked, wide-eyed, like a man on the brink. "Yeah," I muttered. "Just a rough night." She nodded sympathetically and walked away, but I could feel her eyes on me as she did. I should have left right then. I should have gotten back in my truck and driven as far away as possible. But I didn't. Something made me stay. The air in the diner felt heavier the longer I sat there. The hum of conversation around me faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the clinking of cups and plates seemed distant. I glanced out the window and my stomach dropped. There he was, the soldier, standing across the road, staring directly at me through the glass. I blinked, hoping he'd disappear like before. But he didn't. This time he was closer. Close enough that I could see the torn remnants of his uniform, the blood soaking into the fabric. His face was a grotesque mask of rage, the wound in his skull gaping like a second mouth. My breath hitched in my throat. I felt paralyzed, just like in the dreams. His one good eye bore into me, filled with something beyond anger. It was hatred, pure and unfiltered. The waitress walked by again, her tray balanced on one hand. I wanted to scream, to tell her to look, to see if she could see him too. But before I could say a word, there was a deafening crash. The diner's front window shattered, glass exploding everywhere. People screamed, diving for cover as shards flew through the air. I ducked under the table, my heart pounding, but I knew was inside now. I could hear the scraping of boots on the tile floor, slow, deliberate steps moving toward me. I swallowed hard, daring to peek out from under the table. The diner was in chaos. People were scrambling to get out, to escape. But in the midst of it all, asterisk stood perfectly still. His head slowly turned in my direction, his lips curling into a gruesome smile. Blood dripped from his body, pooling at his feet. "You left me to die," he rasped, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. My stomach twisted into knots. My chest tightened. This wasn't a dream anymore. This was real. And he was coming for me. I don't remember running. I just remember being outside, my legs burning as I sprinted down the empty road, away from the diner, away from him. The cold night air stung my face and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I could still hear his words echoing in my mind. Asterisk, you left me to die. Asterisk. The truth of it twisted inside me, clawing at my insides. I had left him. I had run right past him, just another body in the chaos of war. But why was he here now? Why was he haunting me, chasing me down like this? My truck was parked a few blocks away, just out of sight of the diner. I skidded to a stop, fumbled with the keys, and finally yanked the door open. I slammed it shut behind me and jammed the key into the ignition, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the dark road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But as I turned a corner, something flickered in the mirror's edge. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. My heart pounded against my chest and my breath came in ragged gasps. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and forced myself to focus on the road ahead. I had to get away. I had to figure this out. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling of being watched never left me. I made it home just before dawn, exhausted and on edge. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating. I collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the walls, trying to make sense of it all. I had seen things in combat, things that broke most men. But this was something else. Something darker. Something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't sleep that morning. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. That mangled, bloody face. His one good eye staring straight into my soul. By nightfall, I was on edge. My hands shook as I tried to drink, but I couldn't get his voice out of my head. I needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. I went to the old military base where I'd served, hoping to dig through the records, to find some clue about who this soldier was. Maybe there was something I missed, something that could explain why he was coming after me, The base was mostly abandoned now, nothing but crumbling buildings and memories left behind. But there was one section that was still intact, the archives. I made my way inside, the weight of the past pressing down on me with each step. Rows and rows of old files, papers covered in dust, lined the shelves. It felt like walking through a graveyard, each file representing a life, a story, most of them forgotten. I searched through the records, my hands trembling, sweat dripping down my neck. And then I found it, a folder worn and tattered with no name on the front. Inside were a few photos, reports from the field, but what caught my eye was a single handwritten note, barely legible. It wasn't about the soldier, it was about something else, something darker. The note mentioned a ritual performed by the locals in that village, deep in the desert. It spoke of the dead being brought back, not as they were, but as something twisted, vengeful, hungry for retribution. My stomach lurched as I read the last line. The soldiers disturbed the resting place. They will not escape. Asterisk. The pieces clicked into place, but the realization came too late. The village wasn't just a battlefield, it was a graveyard, and we had desecrated it. In the chaos of war, we had unknowingly unleashed something ancient, something evil, and now it wanted revenge. I shoved the papers back into the folder, my heart racing. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, the room went cold. A biting chill settled over me, and my breath hung in the air, thick and visible. I froze, every muscle tensing. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay. The lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the room. I turned, my body shaking, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his figure outlined by the flickering light. His face was worse now, the flesh peeling away, exposing raw bone and muscle. His eye, his one remaining eye, gleamed with fury. "You left me to die!" he rasped, the words dragging out like the last breath of a dying man. I backed away, my legs threatening to give out. I didn't know, but he kept coming. Closer and closer. His skin sloughed off with each step, leaving a trail of blood and rot in his wake. "You left me!" he growled again, his voice like nails scraping across glass. I stumbled back into the shelves, knocking papers and files to the floor. There was nowhere to run. He was getting closer, the air thick with the stench of death. And then, his hand shot out, cold and skeletal, gripping my throat. His fingers were ice, squeezing the life out of me. I clawed at his hand, gasping for breath, but his grip tightened. As the darkness closed in, I saw something in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just anger, it was satisfaction. He was enjoying this. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room spun, my vision blurred, and just as I thought it was over, he leaned in close, his breath hot and rancid against my ear. "You can't run anymore." He knocked me out cold. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the archive room. My throat ached, my chest heaved with every shallow breath, but somehow I was alive. The room was empty. No sign of the soldier, no sign of the horror I had just experienced. I sat up slowly, my body shaking, my mind trying to piece together what had just happened. The papers from the folder were scattered around me, that ominous note still clutched in my hand. The soldiers disturbed the resting place. They will not escape. The words felt like a death sentence, but as I stared at them, something shifted inside me. Maybe I couldn't run anymore. But maybe I didn't need to. I had to face him. Whatever he was, whatever we had unleashed, I couldn't keep running from it. I couldn't keep pretending that I was just a victim. The war had changed me, but this was my chance to make it right. I had left him behind in the desert, but I wouldn't abandon him now. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked out of the archive room. The base was eerily quiet, the wind howling through the broken windows, but I felt something different this time. A calmness, a resolve. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I had to find him, this spirit, this vengeful soldier, and confront him. I made my way to the abandoned barracks. That's where I felt it, the heavy presence, the cold air that prickled my skin. He was there, waiting for me. I could sense him before I even saw him. I stepped into the room, and there he was. The soldier. His form was more solid now, more human, but his face was still twisted with pain and anger, half of it missing, blood still dripping from the wound. He stood in the center of the room, staring at me with those empty, accusing eyes. "I'm here," I said, my voice steady, though my heart raced in my chest. "I'm not running anymore." His gaze locked on mine, and for a moment we just stood there in silence. I didn't know if he could understand me, if he even wanted to, but I had to try. I had to say the words I should have said all those years ago. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my throat tightening. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to leave you. I didn't know what was happening. I was scared, but I'm not scared anymore. You deserve peace. You deserve to rest." His expression didn't change at first. His body remained tense, as if he was ready to lunge at me again, to drag me into the darkness. But then something shifted. His shoulders relaxed, just slightly, and the rage in his eyes dimmed. "I know you were betrayed," I continued, stepping closer, my voice shaking with emotion. "I know you suffered, but this isn't your fight anymore. It's time to let go. You don't have to be angry anymore." His form flickered, like static on a broken TV, and for a split second I saw something else in him. Not a monster, not a vengeful spirit, but a man, a soldier like me, lost, alone, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. He lowered his head, the tension draining from his body. His hand, once skeletal and cold, was now whole again, though translucent, like a ghost caught between worlds. He looked at me one last time, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. It was relief. He stepped back, his form flickering again, fading into the shadows. The air around me grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. As he disappeared, I heard his voice one last time, soft and distant. "Thank you." And then he was gone. The room was still, the only sound the soft rustling of papers in the wind. The cold presence that had haunted me for weeks was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me before slowly turning and walking out of the barracks. The sun was rising now, casting a soft golden light over the abandoned base. For the first time in what felt like forever, I breathed deeply, without fear, without dread. The war had left its scars on me, but it no longer owned me. I had faced my demons, both living and dead, and survived. As I walked back to my truck, I felt something lift off my shoulders, something that had been weighing me down for far too long. The nightmares were over. The haunting was over. I drove away from the base, leaving the past behind me, knowing that whatever had followed me home from the battlefield was finally at rest. And so was I.